Have you ever gone to a movie, excuse me, a movie with a group of people, and then after the movie, maybe it was so good you decided that you needed to get together over a cup of coffee or maybe a glass of wine so that you could all kind of talk through the movie, debrief it maybe, and then once everyone is gathered and seated and ready to chat, one person just barges into the discussion and starts to take over, saying something like, well, I'll tell you what that movie means. And then they just keep talking and talking and talking. Or maybe you're in a book club, there are lots of those around, and there's that one person who is always just so sure about everything in that book and what it means and why it was there. Well, today I just want to tell you that I am that guy. I mean, there is a sense in which, don't you think, that this great story, this short story, the story of the prodigal son, lies at the center of our tradition. It should just stand on its own, right? It's a story. Who am I, after all, to tell you what this or any story means to you? But if you look at your order of worship, it does say sermon. That's where we are now. So I guess just this once, my voice gets to dominate the conversation about this great story. This great, great story. Preaching on a story like the prodigal son is a little dicey. First, as I said, because it really does stand on its own, right? But also because we all know the story so well. We probably already feel like we know what it says. Maybe we all feel like, you could be telling me what this story means. But here we are. So I would like to share, if I could, just a couple of things that you may already have heard or know about this story, but that I had a chance to learn this week. The first thing came to my attention. It isn't as much about the story, I guess, as about the setup for the story. Any of you all who are reading along know that the setup came before the story. At the very beginning of the wonderful reading that our chorus did for us, Luke sort of teased up this story of the prodigal son in something of what some people feel is a problematic way. You may remember what he says. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. And then Luke inserts first the parable about the shepherd who loses the one sheep out of 100 and goes after it. And then Luke inserts a second parable about the woman who lost the 10 coins, or the 1 coin, and then goes after the 1 coin. And then Luke inserts Jesus' parable about the prodigal son, or the one about the loving father, depending on how you look at it. Once there was a man who had 2 sons. But with that setup, with that context of Pharisees and scribes grumbling about Jesus hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, the story gets reduced in a way, and it becomes a story about an older brother. A real grumpy older brother, as older brothers can be sometimes, who couldn't bring himself to forgive his wayward younger brother. You see how Luke's introduction kind of reduces the story in a way. Pharisees grumbling about Jesus hanging out with tax collectors very easily become the grumpy old brother. It's kind of like if we go to see the movie Mary Poppins, or even Mary Poppins Return, and someone asks us, "What's that movie about?" We can say a lot of things to describe the movie. But if we describe the movie by saying, Mary Poppins is a movie about a grumpy old banker, we would miss just a little something that was pretty important to the story, like Mary Poppins and Bert and Jane and Michael. Thanks. Sorry. We just saw the movie recently. Anyway, I didn't pick this up on my own. I have to share. A New Testament scholar who happens to be Jewish, her name is Amy Jill Levine, pointed this out to me this week in a book she wrote called Short Stories by Jesus, which is about all Jesus' parables. And in the book, Amy Jill suggests that this parable of the prodigal son is very likely an original story told by Jesus, a window into the kind of story that he would tell. These stories, these parables, get right to the heart of who he was. Stories have a way of being handed down over the years in the way other literature doesn't. And she suggests that the story is rich and complicated in its own right. But then she goes on to say that Luke, when he sits down to write his gospel 50 years after Jesus, gives this story the limiting introduction, which makes this full, rich, interesting story essentially a condemnation of the older brother. And the reason this is important for her and for all of us is because sometimes the older brother gets compared to the Pharisees. And sometimes those Pharisees and scribes get compared to modern-day Jews. Which means that sometimes this story, this great story, is interpreted in anti-Semitic ways. Jesus giving the Jews a piece of his mind, instead of Jesus telling a story to Jews, about Jews, from Jews. Now, we may not have an appreciation for this sitting here this morning, but unfortunately this story, along with many others in the Bible, have a history of being used against our Jewish brothers and sisters by comparing them either to the older brother or to the rich young fool, all those foils who just don't seem to understand the God of grace and forgiveness. So there's that about this story. But the cool thing about this story, which you already know just by hearing it again, is that in its original telling, it's such a wonderful story. Without an introduction, it stands on its own. And this story is a deep dive into what it's like to live in a family, especially in the first century, and about how love can really live and thrive, even in a family that's as messed up as this man's, or how love can live and thrive even in a family that's as messed up as, dare I say it, ours is. Check this family out and see if it doesn't sound familiar. In this family there is one who is a little impulsive. Someone who can't wait to get out into the world and to conquer it and wants to go. Someone who doesn't always take into account the feelings of others, whose empathy isn't very strong. Someone who makes a mistake or two and gets in over his or her head in this family. Someone who can play dad like a finely tuned violin over and over again, who is so good at getting exactly what he wants. Oh, there's that line again. Treat me like a servant. How many times have we heard that one? It's the kind of person that's in this family, and I ask you, does that kind of person sound familiar to you? Is it you? Or is it someone else? Or a combination, a little of both? Families are known to have things like mistakes and broken promises and waywardness, all blended into the mix that also includes forgiveness and understanding. And not only that, there is the grumpy older brother we talked about. Not the Pharisees, not the Jews, not the official board, not the elders, just a grumpy old big brother or sister, or maybe even the younger one in your family is the one who always feels duty-bound to do the right thing. But most families have that person, right? The one who's responsible, the one who takes care of it, the one who pays the bill, the one who takes out the trash, the one who looks after mom and dad when that time comes. And who, even though they may not like to admit it, kind of likes to have other people in the family notice every once in a while. Can you hear it? Jesus is telling this rich story about how families really are. And then there is the father, who is just about as human as they come. Don't you think there was a part of him that knew just exactly how the younger son's adventure was going to turn out when he handed over the cash? Don't you think that he had rehearsed a stern speech that he was going to deliver to that boy when he returned? Until, of course, he didn't return, and didn't return. Dad began to imagine the worst, and then Dad convinced himself that the worst had actually come to pass, and then he was just dead to the family. Until, who is that on the horizon? He could almost recognize him by his gait, and he couldn't help himself. Filled with compassion, it says, for his lost boy. All the rest didn't matter. He went and he ran to his younger son. And there was about to be a party. Then came word from the slave, "Sir, you may not want to do this, but you might want to take a look out in the field." And sure enough, there was old Reliable swinging his scythe like he had someone in mind. You don't need me to remind you of that conversation. Dad goes out in the field. You can't really hear what they're saying. All you can see is the arms moving, the heart-to-heart begins. And this story begins to teach us on its own merits a radical lesson about family. Amy Jill Levine sums up these lessons for family living. Do whatever it takes to find the lost in your family and then celebrate with others. Don't wait until you receive an apology in family life because you may never get one. Don't wait until you can muster the ability to forgive yourself because you may never find it. Don't stew in your own sense of being ignored, for there is nothing that can be done to retrieve the past. Instead of all this, go have lunch and linger for a while. Go celebrate and invite others to join you. And that's a little tough. This is a story about a man who had 2 sons and desperately loved them both. Last year, a few of us performed a version of this story as part of our Maundy Thursday worship service, communion service. And even though the individual performances were brilliant, especially Matt Bladorn's nuanced take as the father, Jimmy Sweet Laughlin channeled his rage as the older brother. Even though that was the case, we messed up the story. We totally got it wrong when we told it. Because, you see, at the end of the story, Rick Powell, playing the younger brother, got a big old hug from the grouchy big brother. But that's not where Jesus' story ends, is it? Again, you don't need me to point this out to you, but Jesus' story ends with the party raging inside the house, but with Dad and big brother out in the fields. Will dads talk through the trick? Will the 2 of them walk into the house together? If they do, will that narcissistic little brother even pay him any attention, or will he already be 3 sheets to the wind? Will there be a reconciliation, a truce, or maybe just a big old fight to have it out? Or will the big brother just stay out in the field and start a wall between the 2? Or maybe this will be the moment of a reconciliation. Best thing about this story, Jesus tells us, is that we don't know. We don't know. Just like we don't know how our own families are going to turn out. Because it's kind of up to us, isn't it? But in the meantime, isn't it good news that there's a family right in the heart of the Bible that's just like ours?